this right now?
Why don't you call to order first, do the minutes, and then we can do him before.
Yeah, okay, that's kind of where okay, we'd like to go ahead and get started, call the meeting to order. If you would join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, Josh, would you do the roll call this morning?
Yes, sir. Rachel Arizmendi. Oh, nice one.
Nice entrance.
Ashley Ward. Here. Don Bransford. Don Cameron.
Here.
Nancy Cassidy. Here. Helene Dillard. Here. Mike Galla. Here. Crystal Haling. Eric Holst. Jeff Huckabee. Bryce Lundberg. Here. Martha Montoya. Joyce Sterling. Yes. Andy Thulin. Here. Christopher Valadez. Perfect. Mr. President, we have quorum.
Thank you, Josh. At this time, we'd like to move to the approval of the minutes from the April 2nd meeting. If you've had a chance to go through them, we need a motion to accept. We have a second? Any discussion? All those that in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed? So moved. Great. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Chris Valdez. Good to have you here. And if you could, give us a little of your background, and welcome, and good to see you here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, good morning. Good morning, Chris Valadez. Very thankful for this opportunity to be in the service of the governor and serving here in an advisory position. In terms of my career, I've spent close to just about 11 and a half years with the then Grape and Tree Fruit League, more recently known as the California Fresh Fruit Association, working on policy matters, primarily of a labor and environmental interest, which would require me to be very active, so to speak, up here in Sacramento and within the footprints of the Delta region, the San Joaquin Valley, and the Coachella Valley throughout California. I'd say largely around the last 3 years of my time with the Fresh Fruit Association, I've had an opportunity to intertwine what I believe has been a personal interest along with policy and community development interest with respect to looking at policy questions through a more closely related lens, not just onto how it affects management or the employer side, but also how it affects employees, employee communities, and employee livelihoods most directly. There's a lot of good efforts that I've been fortunate enough to become involved in within the San Joaquin Valley region that would at least gives an opportunity from a policy perspective when one is up here using their platform and their position advocating on behalf of whether it's an employer or family farming operations, but to also look at policy questions that are complex and that are directly impactful onto communities as well. And so I'm proud of that opportunity and look forward to continuing, I think, what has been a more broadening of my perspective professionally through my service here on the state board. And more recently, in addition to the fortunate position I found myself in to be appointed by Governor Newsom to this board and serve with all of you for whom I have deep respect for, I'm also transitioning into becoming the president of the Grower Shipper Association on the Central Coast. And so it kind of takes me from region to region, from the Delta throughout the San Joaquin Valley down to Coachella and now over into California's Central Coast. As you all know, with the fair share of challenges, but also opportunities, and what I'm most excited about is what I'm seeing is a mentality, at least on the part of those that I've interacted with thus far, to be a solution, be part of the solution, and look for solutions to make sure that they are remaining sustainable and that for themselves and their communities, that their footprint lasts into the near future as they're addressing farming questions, not only through an economic lens, but I think through a lens which is inclusive of, environmental and human impacts as well. And I think that's exciting for me. That's an exciting career, I think, development and a transition moving over from what has been a largely San Joaquin Valley footprint now into the Central Coast. And I'm just looking forward to utilizing my time and service on this board and in service as president of the Grower Shipper Association to look to identify where we collectively as agriculture and others are part of a broader solution together. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this time. I'm very thankful to be part of this board, and I look forward to engaging.
Thank you. thank you, Chris. We appreciate all your work that you've done, and hopefully we look forward to the input you'll give the board as well. So thank you. Another note, Frank Mueller was not reappointed, and I spoke with him, and he wanted to give his best to all the board, and he really appreciated the time that he served here and the relationships that he made. So it was great having Frank on the board too. So just wanted to pass that on. So let's move on to our first presentation, Water and the Future of the San Joaquin Valley. Ellen Hannick from PPIC. Ellen Hannick is the director of the PPIC Water Policy Center and a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, where she holds the Ellen Hannick Chair in Water Policy. Under her leadership, the center has become a critical source of information and guidance for natural resource management here in California. So welcome, Ellen. Good to see you again.
I'm supporting the forest products industry.
Of course.
For those of you who would like copies of this, we've got both the overview, which is short and sweet, and then the full report. So really delighted to have a chance to meet with you this morning and give you some highlights from this study. This is a sort of third installment in a 3-year study that was aiming to look at the water challenges facing the San Joaquin Valley and look for some promising solutions. And so I'm going to run through some highlights for you and try to particularly think about sort of where I think the state can play an especially useful role. First, I want to just introduce for you, remind that this was a work of a large team, an interdisciplinary team from a number of different organizations, including Fresno State, UC Davis, UC Merced, Point Blue, Conservation Science, and PPIC. And you probably recognize some of those characters that are up there on the screen now. And we also benefited greatly from input over the course of this study from an advisory group that we met with in Fresno numerous times, as well as various other folks that we kind of co-opted along the way, Ashley included, and to get input on the work and to get feedback. This is not even a complete list of all the folks that helped us, but just to acknowledge them and the fact that it was a really great experience for us to do this research in this interactive way, because I think it really enriched what we were able to bring to the table, and also just the conversations around that advisory group table were so rich with people from around the valley, kind of sharing experiences and kind of what they were trying, and that was really inspiring to us. So big takeaway is that this is a big moment for the state in terms of thinking about the successful implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and it's a big moment for the San Joaquin Valley, which is, along with the Central Coast, kind of the ground zero for this great experiment that California is embarking on in terms of really promoting local groundwater management. The San Joaquin Valley is the largest agricultural region in the state if you measure it in terms of dollars. That's been true for a while. Over half of all of the agricultural output in the state originates in the valley. A lot is at stake for the region's economy, for public health, and for the environment in getting this right. And what we find, and this is taking a look at water supply issues, water quality issues, and some of the issues relating to kind of how water and land are managed and stewarded, that the most promising approaches are approaches that really kind of, I guess, stir up all the creative juices, I guess is the way I'd kind of summarize that, and that's approaches that increase flexibility to give people the opportunity to try things out, approaches that provide incentives, and this is especially important for providing incentives to landowners and farmers to make choices that can really kind of get the best out of what is a difficult situation, in terms of needing to manage supply and quality in some different ways. And then, kind of tying this together, we try to emphasize a theme of ability to leverage multiple benefits. And you're going to have a panel right after my presentation on some very exciting things in terms of exactly that, sort of floodplain management and how do you get various kinds of benefits from that. In this region that I'm talking about with you here, it's not as wet as up near, where Bryce and Don are. So there's, not the same largesse all the time with water to spread around on things, but there's a lot of opportunity for multi-benefit approaches and being smart and trying to stack those benefits for water and for land. So the theme of throughout this report, we make a lot of recommendations, and one of them that kind of comes through all of the areas is that increased cooperation and coordination are going to be essential. And this is really a message, especially for within the valley. Right now, there are a lot of different local entities. I think there are 121 groundwater sustainability agencies for 15 basins, not counting, plus a whole lot of other water quality entities and irrigation districts and, communities and so on. Most of the good solutions are going to require scaling up cooperation and coordination, even beyond the GSA level, even beyond the basin level. And this is fundamentally in the hands of folks in the valley and the valley's leaders to really push this. That said, the state and the federal governments can both play really important roles, and I'm going to try to highlight some of those areas. So first thing, SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. This is on the minds of most people that are water managers down there, and a lot of folks in the ag sector that are managing water on their farms, even if they're not in the governance structures, and folks in the cities and the communities, because the clock is ticking on SGMA in the valley. The valley is, this map is the DWR's map of the basins that need to comply with SGMA. Everything that's yellow or orange are basins that need to comply, and everything that's orange is on the fast track. That's the critically overdrafted basins, and you can see that the valley is a big swath of bright orange there. So most of those basins are probably, most of them are actually already getting ready, if they haven't already put initial drafts out on the street for public review. These have to be delivered to the state by January, and implementation has to get underway. There's a good reason for SGMA. It's that we were managing our groundwater in ways that weren't always sustainable, kind of tragedy of the commons. Lot of consequences that we saw during this latest drought: dry wells, both irrigation wells and drinking water wells, sinking lands, damaged infrastructure, and reduced supplies for future droughts. So although it wasn't especially popular, I think, if you had asked everybody in the valley to vote on this in 2014, well, actually we know that no legislator from the valley voted for SGMA, but they didn't have to, and maybe that was a good thing because there were enough votes elsewhere. But there were definitely a lot of folks in the valley who were worried about these trends, and the long-term result is going to be a healthier economy and a more sustainable region, but it's going to, there's going to be some near-term adjustment and adjustment costs that go with that. And that's because in these overdrafted basins in particular, attaining balance is kind of this math question. If you got to tighten your budget, you can either reduce demand, so reduce water use, or you can bring in new water. And bringing in new water is not as easy as it was 100 years ago, because we've already tapped a lot of the best sources. There are definitely options, as I'm going to show you, but those cost money too. So just wanted to kind of show you, the pattern region-wide, and this is going to vary a lot by basin. It's actually easier to develop a picture of this valley-wide of what's been happening with groundwater reserves from one year to the next, and anything below that line and that's red, those are net withdrawals of groundwater. The blue bars are net recharge. Basically, the net recharge valley-wide is happening only in really wet years. Like this one is going to be a banner year. 2017 was as well. But what we need to do is basically manage to be net recharging in a lot of the normal years too. You still are going to want to have that flexibility to draw on groundwater during droughts, but just not that much, you know. So alongside this fundamental sort of supply-demand imbalance that has to be addressed, the Valley is facing really some major changes in how groundwater quality is going to need to be managed. And this is, you know, a way, in a sense, you know, California, I think a lot of folks are looking to California for how we succeed with SGMA, because although we were the last Western state to get statewide legislation requiring groundwater management, in a lot of ways it's a very innovative law because it does rely a lot on local solutions and management. California is also really innovating on the side, in the area of groundwater quality, which is not regulated to nearly the same extent under federal water quality laws. And so this is a picture of the round table of one of the many CV Salts meetings that happened over a decade, which was aiming to kind of initially started really looking especially at the salt balance issue, but really then got heavily into looking at the nitrogen loading issues and safe drinking water issues, and is an effort to kind of pull together various strands of regulation that have come in over the last decade or so, including a dairy order, including the irrigated lands regulatory program. And so this was approved by the regional board about a year ago. It is waiting to be approved by the state board. I'll just say we think we were impressed by kind of the direction that this ended up, the place this approach ended up in, because of the sort of flexibility that it offers, basically by saying folks in highly nitrogen impacted areas, dischargers, they can either stop discharging nitrogen or they can continue to work on improving that situation while immediately providing safe drinking water. And that seems like a practical approach when you're thinking about balancing kind of the economics of the region alongside the urgent need for safe drinking water, also because you can't just clean up the groundwater basin overnight, no matter what you do in terms of your nitrogen management. So there are some potential synergies between managing for groundwater balance and sort of the supply side and managing for quality, but there are also some potential trade-offs, and I just want to highlight, you know, a few of the issues for you this morning. And then just a third area to kind of, you know, close the sort of circle of the kinds of things that we're looking at. These are, you know, thinking about how you steward water and land in a way that, you know, you're balancing supply and demand, you're thinking about water quality, but you also have to recognize water's going to be more scarce in a way than before, and also there's likely to be a good amount of land that's going to come out of production. And we estimate, I'll show you that in a moment, but we estimate at least 500,000 acres coming out of production, and that's out of a base of a little over 5 million, so, you know, about 10%. That could be some combination of permanent and rotationally fallowed land, but either way, it's land that is going to need to be managed in a way that does not create bad things, like, you know, dust, pests, and weeds that are problems for neighboring farms. And there are a lot of ways to manage these lands if it's done carefully in ways that can get other value from the lands. And so we explore that at some length to just kind of give people some ideas about that. But, you know, this is where the multi-benefit approaches really comes in. Thinking about healthy soils, Secretary Ross, excellent. For anybody who did not see her New York Times, is that an infographic or an info cartoon? And what's the? And what and the catchword is we're treating our soil like dirt. Yeah, we got to start treating our dirt like soil. So, lot of potential there. Habitat, obviously, this is an area that has. I'm showing you sort of the different kinds of ecosystems with just a, you know, an example of a critter in each one. But the San Joaquin desert ecosystem, has actually more endangered species than this region does on the riverine side, and there's a lot of potential for getting some benefit from that. Solar already happening, can happen more, and can happen in wildlife-friendly ways. Recharge, obviously, flood protection, you know, some of the same things you're going to hear about from the panel can happen in a creative way, scaling up in this region. So thinking about those things too. So now I'm just going to walk through priorities for action in 4 areas. First is the supplies and demands and bring them into balance. Second, ensuring safe and reliable drinking water. Third is sort of these longer-term water quality management issues. And then the fourth is a bit about the fostering beneficial water and land use transitions. So first, balancing supply and demand. This little donut here shows you the average kind of water balance or water budget for the whole valley for 30 years. We kind of went back a fair way. That's where we find that there's about 1.8 million acre feet a year of groundwater overdraft. When you average out those bars there that I showed you earlier. In order to attain sustainability by 2040, you basically need to either fill in that red with some blue from somewhere, or you need to just make the donut smaller, or some combination. And what we say is it's probably some combination of those two things. We looked at pretty much everything that you could find that was written and analyzed about different kinds of supply projects, and tried to look at them in a way that compared apples to apples, which was not always easy, I'll just say. But this is sort of there's a lot of uncertainty in this, and this is kind of looking out when these projects considered the impacts of climate change. We kind of factored that in. So everything that's in red there, those are sort of big bins that we looked at. That includes a lot of different kinds of projects. Temperance Flat is in that capture and store more local runoff, as is groundwater recharge. Increasing local runoff, that's the headwaters management, sort of enabling more water to come down from the Sierra. Increasing delta imports, that includes water fix, or whatever it will soon be called. Some kind of new conveyance through the delta. That includes Sites Reservoir, that includes Shasta, and a few others. And then, there's some other options considering reducing exports to Southern California. Could that add supplies to the valley, for example? On the demand management side, we looked in a very formal way at agriculture, because agriculture is the big water user in this region, and so that's kind of going to be they're going to be the hot seat and going to be the drivers of a lot of this. But we also did look at urban water use reduction, and we looked at that in particular to see, okay, is population growth going to be increasing pressure on the supplies in this region? And it probably will in some ways, I'll just say, but what we found is that actually just continuing the momentum of water use efficiency that we've been seeing, and that especially happened, during the drought, and now with the new laws for making water conservation a way of life, that it's actually possible for the valley to accommodate all the anticipated population growth to the early 2040s at least, without increasing its water footprint. The urban areas. So in practice, it's going to be some combination, but that also suggests partnership possibilities with agriculture. So we looked at everything that's in red, and I'm just going to show you now highly sort of summarized, compressed information on what we found on the supply side. And so what these bars show you are the blue bars. That's how much, in the best case scenario, you might be able to get in terms of new supply from these different kinds of actions. And then the yellow bar shows you how much it is likely to be affordable by farmers. In other words, that farmers would be willing to invest in and pay for these supplies rather than taking their land out of production. Because for them, it's really it's a profit loss thing. And if the water's if it's $2,000 an acre foot water, maybe some horticulture could pay for that. But that's like, that would be about it, and definitely not even almonds would pay for that year. And this is thinking about long-term affordability. So what we find is that, while there are some big blue bars there, some of those are just not realistic as an investment for agriculture. And I'll highlight in particular increasing local runoff. This is the sort of the headwaters management piece. The water costs of that, and this is highly uncertain also, because this is, you know, sort of the range of how much you could get and everything is uncertain, as well as the cost, but averaged about $4,500 an acre foot. Now, that is not a reason not to manage forests, okay? No. And if you're managing forests, what it highlights is that some of these things, water is just one of the co-benefits, and unless you have investment partners for things, you know, for public management benefits of forests, it's not going to, you can't expect water users to just come in on their own in this case and do it. What we find is that basically you see about a quarter of the overdraft can be filled affordably. That's mainly through recharge projects. Reoperation of the groundwater and surface water system. It's not the big projects, although a few of the big investment projects are kind of on the borderline. Temperance Flat on the borderline, Shasta on the borderline, sites on the borderline. So it may well be that some farmers want to go ahead and invest in those kinds of things. So when you figure maybe a quarter of the supply can be met affordably through investments, then the other piece is managing demand. And what we emphasize here is some findings looking at how you manage that demand makes a big difference. So these bar charts kind of summarize that in a high-level way, looking at both what happens to crop revenue losses and what happens to land fallowing. And this is sort of starting with no new supplies, you're just managing demand, and in the brown bar scenario, you're just being super inflexible. You're not allowing any local water trading. Farmers are everybody is just proportionally cutting. If your basin says 25%, you cut every crop by 25%. That is the most costly way to go because you're cutting your most profitable crops along with your less profitable ones. In that situation, you're fallowing, about 780,000 acres of land. The orange is local water trading, which really significantly cuts costs. So this is groundwater and surface water trading within the basin. That reduces the crop revenue losses by almost half. Fallowing is about the same because it's still about the same amount of water. It is the same amount of water. Then the yellow is valley-wide surface water trading. We're assuming that there's not going to be groundwater trading across basins in these overdrafted basins. Probably people are not going to be comfortable with that. But definitely surface water trading already is done quite a bit. You, again, lower costs quite a bit. You're down to only a third of the costs in terms of revenue losses from the yellow to the brown. And then adding in the blue is adding in that quarter of new supplies so that you're only managing demand for the remaining 3/4. And that's the best. That's kind of what we're calling the optimal kind of approach with combining flexible demand management and affordable new supplies. You're down to 25% of the revenue losses that you would have had in the first alternative, and that's the one that gets you a lot of traction on land fallowing. That gets you down to a little bit over 500,000 acres of land coming out of production. So we also look at this a bit beyond just the crops to look at what happens with dairy and beef as well as with processing, and we look at it not just for revenues but also for farm profits, for regional GDP, and for regional jobs. And this is kind of just showing you not for that inflexible scenario but for the other three, and basically you're cutting job losses and GDP losses in the region by 40% by moving from even that local water trading down to sort of surface water trading and new supplies. So it can really be helpful all around. And when you think about this is happening within a region, a lot of the same folks' jobs are going to be affected so it's important for folks in the valley to be thinking about smart flexibility. And I have a little bullet there just to remind that also what folks call the glide path, which is the sort of progressive over time approach to implementing SGMA, is another really important flexibility tool, because that means you don't have to implement on February 1st of 2020 you don't have to end overdraft overnight. It gives you time to experiment, pilot projects in various on the supply, on the demand management side, on the trading side, and it gives you time to plan if you're going to have to take trees out, so you don't have to take them out in their prime. So a lot of different priorities for getting there. This is not going to be a slam dunk. I've kind of put stars toward the things that I think the state can be especially important as a player. assessing infrastructure needs and modernizing operations. That's kind of in partnership with locals and with the feds. Clarifying how much water is available for recharge. I know many folks in the room are interested in that. Facilitating approvals for trading and banking, beyond clarifying how much water is available for recharge, just being able to kind of move water more flexibly. And then, you know, just kind of, I would say, in the areas where you don't see stars, there are still places where the state can be a helpful partner to locals. So, safe and reliable drinking water. You know, this is kind of the most urgent thing in the region. Whereas SGMA is going to take time to be implemented, this is really something we just got to get done. The Valley is a hot spot for anything you hear about the state's safe drinking water crisis. It's there in the Valley and in large percentage. So the MAP A is systems that were out of compliance with different maximum contaminant levels back last summer. Half of all the systems in the state were in the Valley. 10% of the population, half of all the systems out of compliance. And these are systems that have mostly been out of compliance for at least 3 years. Mostly small systems, mostly less than 500 people, a few larger ones though too. B is the supply piece, which is not always integrated into the safe drinking water policy discussions as much as it needs to be. We really need to be thinking about this together. This is data that the state collected during the drought on wells that were, households whose wells were going dry. That's the blue dots. And the orange are water systems that applied for emergency help. And again, the Valley's a hot spot. Almost 80% of those blue dots are in the Valley. And a lot of shallow domestic wells that were hit because there was a lot of groundwater pumping. And then the orange, again, half of the community water systems that needed emergency help in the Valley. Again, mostly small systems with shallow wells. So priorities here, I put stars for the state priorities on all of these because I think locals are going to have to play an important role in this and are going to actually be essential to any kind of solutions on the ground, but the state really has to play a leadership role here in helping to push this along. There's in addition, a lot of the oxygen in the room on this has been taken up on bullet number 4 of ensuring funding. And I would just like, whatever that solution should be, let's just get it done. It's my view on this. I'm agnostic on what the sources should be, but we gotta start focusing on the technical and managerial side of this. And so that's sort of those other 3 bullets. And there have been some pieces of legislation that have enabled, put some building blocks in place to make this possible, giving the state water board some new authorities relative to consolidation and appointing administrators and so on, but we're not anywhere near where we need to be in terms of having a game plan for how we're going to do this. And I just highlight bullet 3 is an area where I think the GSAs, if they're going to use a glide path, they need to do this. They need to plan for wells that might go dry, and they need to have a plan for how to mitigate that, because otherwise that's easily a significant, significant undesirable and unreasonable results. I don't know if those 2 U's were in the right order, but yeah. Okay, managing groundwater quality for the long term. So this is really, here I'm focusing on the ag side of this, and especially on nitrogen and on salt. I'm sure that you guys have already had conversations about this, probably numerous times, just about thinking about how to manage long-term nitrogen loading. This is Central Valley-wide maps from the FREP report that Thomas Harder led that came out in 2017, looking at a pretty fine level of resolution at ongoing nitrogen loading, and I think this was maybe from about a decade ago, but probably not a whole lot has changed since then. So B is kind of shows you hot spots of nitrogen loading, and anything that's not green you got to be worried about. Let's just say, if it's red, you got to be really worried about it. And map A shows you cropland used by dairies, and you can see why dairies are feeling especially worried about how they're going to do this, because it's and there's some new work that's come out of the representative monitoring program that's just been posted on the regional board site. There's a recognition now, manure is harder to manage in a precise way than inorganic fertilizers, and there's just too much of it on the dairy farms relative to the land that they've got. So that it would just be impossible to manage it efficiently without getting some of that manure off of there. And so this is a big technical challenge, I would say, in addition to kind of a management on the farm issue of sort of how to turn that manure into something that can be a commercially viable product and for somebody else. The other big thing is salt, and the folks on my team who kind of are experts in groundwater quality say that, you know, over the long term, this is the bigger issue for ag. The nitrogen is not a problem for ag per se, it's a drinking water quality issue. And, you know, that's where finding alternative solutions for drinking water can give you some flexibility to continue to continue farming, basically, because if you're farming at all with anything but alfalfa, you're going to be loading some nitrogen. So this is just showing you the salt piece of it, and you know, this is a region. Irrigated agriculture in general is prone to getting salt buildup because when you irrigate, the crop takes the water and the salt stays in the soil. The valley's importing a lot of salt through the delta. There's some salt that's inherently there, and it affects productivity. So this little bar here just shows you for different crops at what point they start to lose productivity. And a lot of the higher value crops that the valley has been going all in on are in that more sensitive range. So it's a threat to revenues, and there are estimates already out there of, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars already in losses because of salinity. Already about 250,000 acres have been taken out of production because of salt. Another 1.5 million acres are impaired by salt, and it's really expensive to tackle this. So there are agronomic solutions. You know, farmers are ingenious at figuring out how to make it work as best they can through the way they manage the water on the lands, as well as, you know, crop switching. There's been CV salts looked a lot at other solutions, including some of the higher tech big investment solutions like desal. Those are all too expensive right now for agriculture. And since the only reason to do this really is for agricultural productivity, if it doesn't pencil out for ag, it's a hard, you know, it's a sort of current costs versus future viability. It's a hard thing for ag. So we anticipate that there's likely to be some more land coming out of production, and in that sense, there's an opportunity here to think smart about land coming out of production for SGMA, for balancing water supply and demand, and land that's likely to come out of production because of salt and productivity, and doing that before the land gets so nasty that you can't grow habitat on it, for example. So anticipating that in a way that provides incentives to folks. And then final thing on quality, and this is sort of the link with recharge and thinking about supply and quality. You know, arguably the salt management, that has some synergies with some of the SGMA requirements on balancing supply and demand, because you can think about that land coming out in a way that kind of maps that together. In the case of recharge, you have some potential trade-offs that folks on the ground are cognizant of and are somewhat worried about in terms of what can they do and how do they manage recharge in ways that make it possible, that keep them from being in trouble with the Regional Water Quality Control Board about irrigated lands and so on. So what this crop wheel shows you, this donut, these are the acres that are at least moderately good for recharge in the San Joaquin Valley. It's a huge area of cropland. It's a good area, you know, it's a lot of good soils. Over half of the irrigated cropland is potentially suitable for recharge from a soil perspective. The only parts that are kind of safe from a nitrogen perspective are the dark blue. Alfalfa, which, you know, fixes nitrogen, you don't have to apply fertilizer, and vines, which don't need a whole lot. You probably don't want to recharge on that orange part because citrus just doesn't want a lot of water, from what I understand, and corn, it has all that dairy manure on it, so that would not be ideal. That whole half there, the green, the bottom green half donut, those are crops that could be suitable agronomically for recharge, but they do use more nitrogen, and so it's thinking about how to do that in ways that are smart. And farmers are already experimenting, and Don, maybe you are as well among these, of thinking about, okay, well, what do we do about our fall fertilizer? Do we maybe not put that on so that if it's a wet winter, you know, things like that, but then also, you know, kind of considering other aspects with respect to, can you be strategic with this water and maybe even clean up the groundwater in some places. So priorities, there are a lot of things to do here in terms of coordinating water quality and quantity management on the ground. New technologies are going to be key. I highlight dairies here, but for salt also. And then, the big thing for the state is regulatory flexibility to manage nitrogen and salt over the long term, including for recharge. And this is where, actually, although the word recharge does not appear in the salt and nitrate control program that the regional board has adopted, it has the potential to be managed flexibly for this purpose. So that's an area to kind of, I would suggest, to build out and gain the experience with. And so finally, fostering beneficial water and land use transitions. Talked about just the likelihood of some land coming out of production. This is another donut just to show you that right now we're not ready for this in any way, I would say. What this donut shows you, the part that's not yellow, are sort of estimated acreage that could fit into some current planning processes or sort of likely things. The biggest one is the San Joaquin Desert ecosystem. That is the entire 80,000 acres in the recovery plan that was developed some years back for the San Joaquin Desert ecosystem. At the time, they thought that was a huge amount of land relative to what potentially could be available. The 9%, that's our rough estimate of solar that could be additional solar that could go onto cropland in the valley given the state's solar goals. And then a couple small slivers for riparian corridor and floodplain habitat and intermittent wetlands of the kind we're thinking like Kern Water Bank type operations that really are managed for habitat as well as for recharge. And then the rest is just other land that's likely to come out, even in this better case scenario. And I think the way to think about this is not that any of this is going to happen, right? You would need incentives and a whole lot of things for even the part that's not yellow to happen, but that we need to be thinking about how to steward all these lands. And I think there's potential for that. We haven't even delved really into the healthy soils piece and carbon capture and expanding the sort of range of things. In order for that to happen, there's a lot of tools that we have, but we've got to amp it up. And the first one is initiating a broad-based inclusive planning process that goes everybody's just been planning for Sigma right now in the very local, get those GSP plans ready. This is bigger. This is thinking about it in a broader sense. And I would say the county is probably not big enough usually for this, for some of the planning issues that you want to think about, salt, habitat, recharge investments, how to spend money smartly and invest money in water smartly. It really pays to scale that up. So that means ideally some regional work, including maybe with this in the context of the San Joaquin Partnership, or Partnership for the San Joaquin Valley. So then there's flexible regulatory approaches where the state and the feds can be important, providing financial incentives, boosting technical support and R&D. And I know the CFA and the state board are interested in a lot of these. I just wanted to highlight a couple things for you for food for thought. One is on the funding and incentive side. There are a lot of different pockets of money out there already. They're not pooled, and mostly they're used for working lands rather than for thinking of some of these, make these former irrigated lands also working in a smart way. I think GSA fees sometimes will come in as an additional source of money. And I'm highlighting here USDA, your sister agency that's very active in the Valley as a potential partner where we think, they actually supported this research to look deeply at what they do, and they're interested in engaging. Some of the things that could be done really involve state-federal partnership, and I'm highlighting in particular the CREP, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, which is a state-federal program. It's being used for exactly these kind of things in some other states, and we could do that here, I think. And then the other I wanted to highlight, obviously, UC Extension is key, NGOs and USDA, technical assistance, but also the role of RCDs. resource conservation districts can be really important in working with growers on these things. And the valley is very underfunded in this area right now. And you can see that those gray splotches there. The valley also is actually not covered by RCDs in many places. So thinking about that as we sort of, you know, roll these things out. So how can the state be most helpful now? You know, one, let's get this safe drinking water thing done. Financial, technical, and managerial, whatever you all can do to help push that forward, I think would be great. And then the second kind of bin of things is supporting the region's transition to groundwater sustainability, recognizing that this is not going to happen overnight. The first 5 years are going to be really key for experimentation. The first 5 years of the plans, people are going to be trying out their supply projects. Some people are going to be sticking their neck out and trying to do some demand management projects. Let's help them do that. And part of that is on the state side, regulatory clarity and flexibility, consistency, getting the state's own regulatory structures in place so that it can be supportive, and then, you know, and then kind of helping folks in the valley to do some of this other stuff. And I don't think massive amounts of money are actually needed for this. I think this is sort of judicious, smart incentivizing that can really help a lot. And with that, I'll show you a nice photo, a set of nice photos. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. We'll open it up for questions. Joy, go ahead.
Thank you so much for an excellent presentation, and also the call to action on clean, affordable drinking water fund. I was surprised under the new supply, absolutely zero for recycling. That seems.
I'll explain to you why.
Thank you.
If we were on the coast, and I would say probably in the Central Coast, it would be a different story. But most of the wastewater is actually already spread on land in the valley. Certain communities do send it into the San Joaquin River, and then it's part of water flowing into the delta, and so there's competition at certain times of the year. There's competition that's already spoken for, basically, either by downstream water right holders, exporters, or for the environment. And so there's a little bit. There is a sliver there, but it's very tiny because there's just not that much that is likely to be net new water. And so definitely people are investing in projects to move some of that water around. But in terms of the groundwater basin coming into balance, you got to add net new supplies, and that won't do it here. In coastal areas, it definitely can.
I'd like to ask a question on this slide, Alan.
Mm-hmm.
On the capture, you know, you're showing great opportunity on capturing and storing more local runoff. Did you talk to the regulators about that? Because, you know, when you have high flows, I mean, we're running into this issue on sites where you have high river flows, and they want those flows because they have environmental benefits. And we had Ms. Yarnoff speak yesterday, and she has these flow diagrams, and so what type of did you talk to the regulators on this? Because I'm just curious, because how much is really there once they say, wait a minute.
So I think this is going to be a really interesting space from a regulatory perspective. What we relied on was a couple of studies that have been done just to kind of try to scope in a big picture way how much water could be available for recharge in different regions. And this is actually not even counting Sac Valley water. This is you know, within so it's mainly San Joaquin River region water, because in the Tulare Basin they pretty much capture that, except in really wet years already. If you look at the study that Helen Dahlke did with Tiffany Coaches, they find on average for, you know, that sort of top 10th percentile of flows, they find almost 500,000 acre-feet potentially available. The DWR study finds you know, a similar amount. When we analyzed that data, it looked to us like there potentially was higher, maybe up to 1 million acre-feet a year on average. Now, some of that is just not feasible to capture physically, probably, because it just comes so fast, although this is where on-farm, you know, and floodplain co-management could potentially make that possible. The board is looking at how to, the board would like to make it possible to do more, and I think they're starting in a very cautious way with baby steps on this, and I think what I'd like to see here is a watershed by watershed kind of look involving regulators, but also folks that are water users in the watershed and downstream to figure out kind of what can be done in a reasonable way. That's why, so that 21% might be optimistic.
Thank you, Ellen. What a fabulous presentation from a government an economist with a government think tank. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bryce.
Ellen, the 500,000 acres. Do you think that the communities where that acreage is ready for this information, or ready for the is it coming, or you think it's going to be challenged? You know, and I think in many agricultural communities, the question's asked: is this real? Is this right? Should we accept this, or should we press for a different direction?
So, it is very hard for local political leaders to get out in front on this. Understandably, for the same reason it was hard for San Joaquin Valley legislators to vote yes for SGMA. But a lot of folks on the ground that are looking at the numbers recognize this, and actually you see, you know, a lot of the larger growers are already making their plans kind of accordingly. And, you know, these are big picture numbers. The GSAs, the groundwater sustainability plans are going to come out with their own numbers, which may be a little more optimistic than what we're showing. If you don't include that latest drought, it doesn't look as bad. For example, you know, I think folks are also hoping that they can increase that supply piece of it. And, you know, I'd be happy to see that able to happen if it's done in an also, you know, kind of a responsible way. But, you know, I think, yeah, I think the writing is kind of on the wall that some land's going to come out of production. And so, to me, the issue is how to think about that in the context of everything else that's happening in the valley. It's not just SGMA that's happening. You know, crops are, market conditions are evolving, technology is continuing to evolve. This could end up not even being that felt, perceptible, if you know, sort of workforce and technology and land management is done in a smart way.
Your presentation would indicate that the revenue impacts can be mitigated more so than the amount of fallow land, and I think that's really an important focus.
Yeah.
Would you say this would be done by the choice of the landowner, or would you say this should be done through a more of a public policy effort, or what would you say the best way to implement the reduction?
So, you know, I don't know anybody in the valley who's thinking about this who would like to see command and control on this thing. You know, it's very much has to be something where incentives are provided to growers, and you're starting to see some interesting experiments already. So down like Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District in Kern County, what they're looking at is actually not even, you know, not even telling farmers they have to fallow or anything like that, rather having an opportunity for them, they have a groundwater allocation, and if they, they sort of pay just a nominal fee for that first part of the allocation, and then if they want to pump more, then they pay significantly more money, enough money to enable the district to acquire some lands from willing sellers and, create that water savings. That's an example. That's very similar to kind of what's done in Orange County, where they've managed their groundwater in that way, where if you really need extra water beyond your normal allocation, you can have it. I think, thinking about incentives is key, and to not have it just be piecemeal and to have it kind of be able to provide added value for growers, that's where public policy can really come in, not just at that sort of local irrigation district scale, kind of bigger, because, for example, the state and USDA could, provide some incentives for certain kinds of stewardship on lands, maybe in areas that are going to be especially suitable. And you could, therefore imagine kind of, not having a postage stamp approach to it and a better overall benefit for the region.
I thank you also for a very comprehensive and interesting presentation. I just had a question about, did I understand that you said something to the effect that if we could ease use in Southern California, it would increase availability, because the Salton Sea of Cortez project is using that as one of their arguments?
So what we specifically looked at in this case was kind of continued conservation in Southern California and enabling them to basically not take as much of their state water project allocation. And that was just one of the potential ways that you could imagine this happening. They're also making a lot of investments in local supplies down there, big investments in recycled water, which does save net water in that region, because otherwise, a lot of it otherwise would go to the ocean. Stormwater capture in urban communities, and so even desal in some cases. So if you think about those projects, maybe there's some scope for Valley water users to co-invest with them and then, make it worth everybody's while. Yeah.
Thank you, Dawn. Alan, I think you opened up some eyes with this presentation, and particularly if you can clarify, as managers and others, decision makers are going to prioritize in time which lands should be perhaps first or should be considered first for potential consideration on the retirement question. Where do you see those lands, those white lands, with respect to those that are solely dependent upon groundwater quality, whether it's a community or whether it's large ag intensity, coming into that, I won't call it the prioritization framework, but I think at least within a framework of consideration, once you start overlaying those that are completely groundwater dependent and or those that are salt impacted with respect to the importation of water and just soil conditions, and where some of those white lands may or may not fit higher on the priority scale as may have been previously considered to have been the case or projected to be the case, because again, they're not importing or bringing in any surface water. I think when you bring up the salts layer and you talk about the sigma pressure from a supply scale, it starts to, I think, add another layer of complexity, but also opportunity with respect to how you start thinking about prioritizing which lands, and white lands, I think, in general have been presumed or thought of to be, well, those might be earlier or towards the front of the line, but it may or may not be the case with the salt layer.
And I would say even with the the white lands, which is basically lands that on a white piece of paper don't have a irrigation district
right.
on them. And actually you do have some places that have an irrigation district without surface water too. So the folks that are groundwater only, some of those lands are really productive. And so I just pulled this slide back up to kind of highlight the gap between inflexible water use and local water trading, so going from the brown to the orange. A lot of that is flexibility to get water to willing buyers on white lands. they're going to also be some of the most motivated to invest in supplies as well, a present company included. And so I know that there are conversations happening in the different basins precisely about kind of how can people potentially work together. So to me, I'd rather not have it be about necessarily, that's where you think about the local infrastructure and flexibility, and then from a jobs perspective, that might be better for the region too. The SALT piece to me is about, I think we need to have a big GIS charrette with folks from around the region, sort of say, okay, here's the SALT map, here's some potential good habitat investment areas, here's some good recharge areas, here's some water quality hotspots, and kind of how do we think about kind of how we want to opt in solar, right? How do we want to think about considering those things together to provide incentives for certain areas to take land, put land into other uses?
If I could just add one thing onto that, because I know we have to move on, but I think the bandwidth at the county level through local planners is very narrow, and I think that's why we've seen some boards of supervisors step back from doing what they originally thought they would do for white areas. And so I think that's an area for us to focus on is where's the technical assistance from a state level to really support so that the local land use planning is still local land use planning. It has to be in this regional scope. But I just see, and I'm looking at Mary Ann Wormerdam from rural counties, I just know how much of a, and she was talking, so, I'm just trying to raise money for her and provide some technical assistance. But I think our boards of supervisors, these land use planning decisions are community decisions, and some of them in the past have not necessarily benefited the whole community. And so being able to step up and provide some additional technical expertise, incentives for planning, whatever it might be, I think now is a time for us to think about that as we put together the water resilience portfolio for the state of California.
Exactly, yeah.
First, I just want to say thank you again to you guys each doing this report. I just think it provides an incredibly valuable set of, well-researched, analyzed, vetted data that everybody can work with to try to prepare for the future. So you guys did outstanding work, and I just think it's invaluable. So I have a question on the previous slide. So can that 21% get larger if some of the purposes of recharge are for public benefit? So let's say improving water quality or avoiding subsidence or habitat. Could that potential water available grow because it doesn't necessarily have to be, it just augments that pie, so it's not just what's readily affordable for farmers?
Maybe, but I'll just say this is already pretty optimistic in terms of what could be regulatorily.
But
Okay.
you need to recognize that there are multiple benefits that come off of that, not just groundwater storage. And so
Sure.
So you need to figure out a way to, and the next program is the same way. We've got to figure out a way to weigh or score or provide environmental benefits and get credit for those because they just drop through.
No, I totally agreed. What my hesitation is less about. I mean, I think almost all of this could provide environmental benefits, and I think this is, in order to get that much, it's going to have to be a lot of floodplain management and everything. My hesitation is just that, I think we're up to like 380,000 acre-feet average or something like that from within the valley. I'm guessing it'll be hard to permit more than that, for whatever purpose. That's just my. Even though that blue bar is, remember, that's the super in your wildest dreams blue bar there, yeah.
But Ellen, before you step down from
Yes,
the
sir.
podium there, that's one real, and I know you have, I'm sure you have the number because you gave the number, the dollar of change if you have flexibility in the system, but what's the total impact of taking out 500,000 acres in the San Joaquin Valley, and not just the direct impact of the cost to the grower, but to the community, to the counties, the state as far as tax base,
So,
land
okay.
values?
So we kind of stuck with the things that are kind of pretty straight, observable. So the downstream impacts, including, processing and beef and dairy. We didn't get into the tax side of it. I always get a little nervous when with analyses that look at all of the potential multiplier effects, because if you add up all the multiplier effects from every sector, you get an economy that's 3 times bigger than it is. So,
Well, that's my point.
no, but what I mean is that, in practice, there are adjustments and other things happen. So I'm comfortable saying GDP losses to the region, drop in the local water trading case, which is already pretty good compared to inflexibility, drop from a couple billion down to less than a billion, with adding in some valley-wide surface water trading and new supplies. That is a fraction of a % of the regional economy, and that's where it will be felt at the local level for the person who's going to fallow. But I feel like with everything, and that's just relative to kind of holding everything else constant. To me, it feels like having an intentional strategy to just be, transformative about the Valley's economy more generally, and kind of seizing opportunities for workforce development and value-added products and all of those things. This could potentially almost not be noticed from the regional economy perspective. And if the lands are stewarded in a good way, you provide. San Joaquin River is now a recreational spot for kids go there for camping and stuff, which before it was a garbage dump, right? So that the area that's been there are ways in which sort of things that we don't count in the economy even are potentially can be improved if we make. I sometimes say if we make lemonade out of the lemons. I don't know if that helps a little bit.
No, I understand. I understand it's not a finite number, and things will change as we progress through this. But taking out 500,000 acres is going to be, I think, a huge economic impact on the valley.
I think
we've seen what's happened in Westlands, where they've idled land, and the communities there.
Right. No, and that's where there can be localized impacts, and that's sort of thinking about being smart about trading strategies and investing in communities with some of the gains from that and so on. We have to think about this in strategic ways, but I don't know, maybe I'm cursed with optimism. So.
Well, I think as growers we're all optimistic, but the reality is it's gonna hurt. So. Yeah. Anyway, I appreciate your presentation too. Thank you very much. Always good to see you.
Thank you.
So thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to reactivating California floodplains. We have a group with us today: David Guy from the Northern California Water Association, Jacob Katz from California Trout, Louis Blair from Reclamation District 108, Megan Hertel from the Audubon, California, Roger Cornwell from River Garden Farms, Paul Butner, California Rice Commission, and Mark Rilcombe from Ducks Unlimited. So welcome. I'm not sure who's going to key this up, but I bet David is going to be in the middle here. So welcome. Good to have you here.
Yeah, good morning. Is that on? Can you hear? We're good? Hey, well, good morning. Thank you, Chairman Cameron, Secretary Ross, and great members of the board. Really an opportunity to be here. Thank you so much for that. We're going to talk today a little bit about reactivating our floodplains in the Sacramento Valley as kind of a new way forward. And I guess is what we're hoping that today that you will join us in kind of reimagining our water system here in California with some ideas that you're going to hear about today from a wonderful group of folks. Do I need to advance? Is there a clicker? Justin, you use this? Okay. Is that the best? Oops. Is this? Can't do anything unless I'm moving my hand. All right, yeah, thank you. I guess we'll just use the keypad, it looks like is working best. I think folks saw the governor's State of the State, and of course we truly appreciated the shout out to the opportunity to reactivate our floodplains here in California. And of course the other day, I think if you look at the executive order that the governor put together with a lot of folks' help around here, the first two items that were called out were multi-benefit approaches and natural infrastructure, including floodplains. And then regional approaches is obviously part of that. So we're very encouraged by that, and just think it's a wonderful opportunity. We have a wonderful coalition that is working on this. The documents that were handed around, the coalition includes logos from many of you sitting around the table here today, which is great. Many of the folks you're going to hear from, and then we have folks like Mary Ann here from RCRC, and then interestingly enough, former Secretary Lyons has a project on the San Joaquin Valley that actually reactivated the floodplain, so he's an expert on this as well. So as what we're going to do today is through a combination of science, water management, and then even some film, we're going to tell a little bit of a story on how we can reimagine the water system here in California through reactivating our floodplains. And that'll include Jacob Katz, Roger Cornwell, Louis Baer, Megan Hurdle from Audubon, Mark Biddlecom from Ducks Unlimited, and Paul Butner from the Rice Commission. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jacob. We'll start with a little bit of science and look forward to the conversation.
Well, Secretary Ross, members of the board, thank you for having us. It's a great privilege to be here today with my colleagues and friends from the Sacramento Valley. And I think that you'll find that the common ground that we represent, that the floodplain represents, there's many more logos on that slide behind you than are here in the room. So. With that, I've been asked to give a little bit of a background about the Sacramento Valley, about how it worked and how it might work in the future. So, you know, as we all know, the Sac Valley is this amazing mosaic of agricultural productivity, of orchards, of row crops, of rice, of course, punctuated with the beautiful Sutter Buttes right in the middle of it. But before it was this incredible landscape of agricultural production, it was one of wild life production. Ducks and geese to fill the skies, to literally fill the skies. That is something that unless you're there at dawn to watch, you know, the geese settle in at Gray Lodge, you don't quite get the magnitude of what that means, right? Tens of millions of waterfowl, elk, antelope down on the valley floor, and of course 2 million salmon that swam through the Golden Gate and into the valley every year, right? 1 million turning right into the San Joaquin, another million coming up into the Sacramento, and not just any salmon. This is the most diverse run of king salmon, of Chinook salmon on Earth, and that was because the valley is this incredible mosaic, this diversity of different habitats, of different patterns, of the different ways that water came out of the mountains and down and flowed across our landscape. So we call that dynamic permanence. I don't mean to get jargony, but the idea here is that it's not the same every year. But what it's the same is it's this incredible, moving, dynamic place. That there is a mosaic of wetlands of different kinds that every year provided this engine of natural productivity for that natural heritage that we have as Californians, right? And that engine of productivity was flooding, was wetlands, was wet lands, right? And these names that are so familiar to us, Colusa, Butte, Sutter, American, before those were our counties, those were flood basins. And what's a flood basin? A flood basin is just where water has the room to spread out, to slow down, to get that ground wet. These are wetlands. And those wetlands have this incredible capacity to make life, right? And we know that. We know that they're so productive. This is the heart of California's rice country. And rice is the heart of the Sacramento Valley's agriculture. And that happens out there on these very same floodplains. So what happened? Well, we did, right? And you could talk long about what it's about, but it's really actually pretty simple, right? So European settlement and development really can be brought down into a really simple concept. You can talk about levees, you can talk about diversions, you can talk about infrastructure, or you can just understand that where water once spread out, once slowed down, everything we've done has hurried that water off the landscape. We're kind of like the anti-beaver, right? This is every Safeway parking lot is really no different than our fields, and critically, also our bypasses. We're here to talk about floodplains. So often when people talk about floodplains, they talk about our bypasses. It's meant synonymously. But really, the whole valley floor was once a floodplain of some kind. The bypasses represent those places where we still have access, critically still have access to the floodplain. That's really important, and we're really focused on it, but it's not the whole story. The historical floodplains that are on the dry side of those levees, over 500,000 acres of rice that are still there. Just because it's not going to be easy to get fish and water to them doesn't mean they don't have a very important part to play in rebuilding our river ecosystems, in rebuilding the capacity to make fish and to have healthy systems. Why is it so important to have a functioning river system? Because a functioning system makes more fish. More fish give us the regulatory security to actually pass water from where it's abundant to where it's needed. That's important for our farms and for our cities. What we're talking about is an understanding that says that endangered species are not a necessary. They're not an obvious or a unavoidable consequence of development. They're a direct consequence of a water infrastructure put in place when we didn't know how rivers worked, when we didn't know how fish used these habitats, or ducks or geese or other critters. And so I'm standing here before you, one representative of a family of scientists that over the last 2 decades, my mentors, Peter Moyle, Ted Summer, who's now DWR's head scientist, my colleague Carson Jeffries, an incredible team at UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences, down at UC Merced, up at Chico, have been working to show the importance of the floodplain, how it works. And what's a floodplain? Again, a floodplain is this place where water slows. And I'm going to summarize all of that in 3 slides. All right, this is an experiment that on the floodplain that we did just across, 10 minutes from here, just across the river in Yolo Bypass. And what did we do? The photograph you see there is me standing on the old pump house at the Conway Ranch. That has been upgraded. It's now the surface water supply for the towns of Davis and Woodland. But we took a very simple idea. Let's take salmon, put them in cages, and show how they look in the river. That's what those floating cages are here. These are cages have crab pots on them so that they float. In each of those cages is 10 little fish. We did the same thing just on the other side of the levee, right? What's a levee? A pile of dirt, right, that separates the river as we know it, that water between 2 rip-rapped steep banks, from the floodplain. What's the canal? The canal is the way that water flows across the floodplain now in our managed agricultural system. And we also put similar cages out in a rice field. That rice field represents the way that water used to spread out and slow down. That's the natural flood pattern, right? And what did we find? Not only did we find that the fish on the floodplain grew 700 times faster than those in the river. Right, because they have fertilizer. This is Dawn's actually not wrong at all, right? So we see the 700% is pretty, that's just in just 3 weeks, right? But here is why. They are fertilized. They are, what do we mean by fertile? We mean that that floodplain is fertile. The food is where the floodplain, the food is on the floodplain. And that in the river system, you basically have, the river system as we manage it now, you have steep-sided banks, you have cold, fast water, you have an environment that isn't conducive to the simplest idea in natural systems, which is getting energy into the system. What's energy in all systems? Right? In all natural systems, it's food. Where does that food come from? It comes from the sun. It's sunlight. So what's happening here? We have the Sac River, which is going by quickly, an average turnover about 2 seconds. It has not very much food in it. In the canal, you have, quite a bit longer time where that water residence, it's closer to a puddle, closer to a wetland, it has more food. But look at the floodplain. That is solid protein. That is solid energy. That is money wasted. That is productivity wasted. because this is what makes fish. This is what makes Delta smelt, that's what makes salmon, and we have been leaving that on the dry side of the river because we divorced the river from where, you know, where the fish are from where the food is. And so really we have a system that isn't terribly complicated. It's not rocket science, I joke, but it is physics. Dr. Helene remembers this guy, right? Yeah, right? You guys remember a simple, maybe, you know, energy and mass are related? When you cut off 95% of the floodplain, and that is where the food is generated, you have created fairly simple math. You've been left with a fraction of the energy delivered to the aquatic ecosystem. That means you have a fraction of the biomass. 5% roughly of the fish, that's what we see. Until we change this, and it is in your hands as much as anybody's, until we change that, we are going to be in this situation. We've run out of energy. My kids' toys don't work when I pull the batteries out of them, right? Your car doesn't work without gas. An ecosystem doesn't work without the energy it needs in order to create that biomass. And it's a simple thing, right? What's it? Sun? Sunlight and carbon from the air, right? With plants. Plants take that, they make sugar. That sugar then gets turned into what? Bacteria, microbes break down those plants. They're eaten by bugs. Bugs are eaten by fish. Those fish get bigger in a matter of weeks. It doesn't happen overnight, right? You can't just get it wet. It's about keeping it wet. It's about puddles. But that's where you get floodplain fatties. And these fish will come back. We can have a system that produces agricultural production in summer and in winter has the mechanics to create a fertile, robust population of native fish. It's time to do that, right? And this is just if you didn't believe me, you can maybe believe the fish. This is 5 weeks on the Nags floodplain. These are the fish captured every week. This is the making of a floodplain fatty. Doesn't take long. So with that, I will just leave you with this simple idea, right? That we need to spread it, slow it, sink it, right? You just heard a lot about sinking it, but that also allows us to grow it. As Dawn was just talking about, there are multiple benefits that come from integrating a knowledge of nature, from a knowledge of natural process, of landscape natural process, into how we manage our resources. And that it needn't just be recharge or ecosystem benefits. They come together, understanding how we build that portfolio, that menu for growers to take advantage of in their location is the key to success. So I leave you with puddle power. Amen. Thank you.
Sure, I could introduce this real quick. Thank you, everybody. I would just like to, my name is Roger Cornwell, River Garden Farms. I'd like to take a minute to introduce a short piece that we developed. And really, I just had to try to outdo Jacob because every time he talks, he gets everybody mesmerized. So really, this is taking what Jacob said and breaking it down into something that, for me, visually is easier to understand. And we try to keep the message very simple and understandable by all audiences. Go ahead, Jacob.
5%. That's what's left of California's salmon population. Once the largest floodplain in the world, the Golden State Central Valley is a fraction of what it once was. Home to an abundance of wildlife, the floodplains provided everything needed for life to flourish. But in the 1800s, something changed here. People from all over the world began to settle in these fertile lands. We built cities, paved roads, and grew crops to support a booming population. Today, just 5% of the original floodplain habitat remains, which, to no surprise, has left us with just 5% of the native fish. However, not all is lost. Work is being done to reverse this troubling statistic. In a first-of-its-kind partnership, farmers, scientists, water districts, and conservation groups are uniting to recreate the floodplains. And their goal? to one day tell the tale of a triumphant return of California's Chinook salmon. The collaboration is producing solutions that are as clever as they are simple, and early results show great promise. Like all species, fish need to eat, but there's simply not enough food in the river to nourish juvenile salmon for their journey to the ocean. The river is too cold and too swift to produce a stable supply of bugs which fish depend on for nutrition. Malnourished, the salmon grow weak and are unable to avoid predators and overcome spells when there's no food at all. Few ever make it to the ocean. That's why this coalition is using farm fields as a solution. A place that grows food for families during the spring and summer, turns out, is the perfect place to grow food for fish in the winter. So how does it work? Rice fields are flooded during the winter to help decompose the remaining rice straw left over from harvest. These shallow puddles serve as a massive solar panel, warming the decomposing rice straw, turning carbon into algae and creating a fertile breeding ground for millions of bugs. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet for young salmon, serving up a delicious spread of highly nutritious floating fillets, something fish used to get before they were cut off from their food supply. By using rice fields to create these surrogate floodplains, our coalition is reconnecting fish with their natural food supply. Scientists and farmers are delivering the food to the fish by pumping the bugs grown on the fields into the Sacramento River. First, water is borrowed from the river onto rice fields. There it sits, breaking plant life down into carbon. Sunlight warms the water, forming algae, and attracting insects to feast and reproduce. This water, now dense with nutrients, is moved right back into the river, creating a vital food supply for young fish. This new food supply gives young salmon a vastly improved shot at survival. It's a win-win solution. Standing together, our collective efforts today ensure our success tomorrow. This is the new way forward.
Excellent. I'm glad there was a video break between me and Jacob. All right, let's see if my presentation comes up. Great. So good morning. My name is Megan Hurdle. I'm the Director of Land and Water Conservation with Audubon, California. And as you might guess, my job here is to lift your eyes upward and to talk a little bit about the birds that rely on the Central Valley, that have been using this valley for thousands of years as a place to overwinter, to breed, to stop and rest and refuel on their journeys. So just like salmon and fish, there are birds that migrate. So salmon start in the rivers and they migrate out to the ocean and then they return to repeat that life cycle. Well, there are birds that do exactly the same thing, and it's remarkable because they are flying thousands of miles. And what they're using are flyways. They're basically these super highways in the sky, and if you walk out in downtown Sacramento in fall or winter and it's quiet, you can hear them flying overhead. That's how I always know the migratory waterbird season has started. These flyways are linking us across hemispheres, across countries, across counties and states, across political boundaries. They're really what knit us together. And it's really important that we have the habitat and the food that they need here when they come and stop here. And of course, the flyway that we've got here is the Pacific Flyway, and the key stopping point is our Central Valley, also the home to one of the best agricultural places in the world, right? And so we've got birds that are flying here, and they're coming and they're stopping and resting and refueling before heading further south, or we have ones that are coming here to overwinter. And what we do here matters, and I promise I'm not pandering to people in the audience or on the board with this example, but this bird here, does anyone know this bird? Well done, I'm impressed. I wish I brought a prize for that one. So not the Canada goose that you see on the golf course, but the Aleutian goose, and this is a great example about why what we do here matters. So we thought this bird was extinct. We thought it was completely gone. And then a small handful of them were found off the islands in Alaska. It was one of the first species put on the Endangered Species Act. And then they did recovery efforts, both in their breeding grounds, but also here in the Central Valley, where 90% of the wintering population comes. This bird, delisted. It's been recovered. And that's because we found a way to work with private landowners to mimic historic ecosystem function and to bring the population back, and it shows why what we do here matters so much for birds. So you're gonna hear all of the NGOs and the resource groups say this, but we have had complete landscape level change in the last 200 years. It's not just the floodplain. We've lost our riverside forest, we've lost our grassland habitat, But despite that, you can still see this. So this is a little bit about what Jacob was alluding to, what he gets to see when he's out in a blind in Gray Lodge, and the birds are all around him. You could also see this in the Yolo bypass just a few months ago. Bryce, I bet you've seen this out on your field. Same thing, Don, right? Thousands of snow geese crowding into flooded rice fields post-harvest to use them as places to stop and feed. And despite all that habitat loss, we still have huge numbers of birds, 5 to 7 million waterfowl, 350,000 shorebirds coming through here. So it's critical that we find ways to support them. I stole this map from Mark, which I want to say thank you since he's coming up later. This is a Ducks Unlimited map, but this just shows you the remaining habitat in the Central Valley that water birds use. Not a lot up there, right? So the bright colors, the orange, the red, and the blue, those are our last wetlands. The green, which I'm going to zoom in here on the Sacramento Valley, which isn't popping on this, but it's the rice fields. There's roughly 325,000 acres of rice that are flooded up in winter to provide habitat. That's incredible. It's resulted in the Sacramento Valley being designated as a site of hemispheric importance for shorebirds. So Audubon and many others have spent more than a decade partnering with rice farmers. I think Don was at one of our first meetings 10 years ago where we went out and we talked about what birds need. And the rice farmers said, well, we think we can do this on the ground for birds. Then we used best available science to test it. And when it worked for birds and it worked for the farmers, we worked with federal and state agencies to roll it out at a landscape level scale. And the benefit of this is that it's dynamic, it's on private lands, and it's an incredible complement to our public wetlands and our private wetlands that are protected habitat. So in closing, I wanted to leave you with a bird's eye view. Not many of us get to see this. I guess if we're flying into Sacramento Airport at the right time, you can see this. So these white blotches up here, those are snow geese, thousands of them. And you can see why when you're flying over the landscape, a bird would look at these flooded rice fields and think, this is a floodplain, right? I'm gonna land there. And it's really an opportunity for us to think about how do we work in the working landscape to recreate what was there historically. Birds and fish evolve together. We should be able to find practices that work for them. I mean, we're not gonna have all easy decisions when it comes to water. I think Ellen's presentation showed that we're gonna have some hard conversations, but there are also opportunities to look for those multiple benefit places where we can use land and water to serve multiple purposes. And we do that through innovative projects. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Louis to tell you about some of those projects.
Secretary Ross, members of the board, thanks for the opportunity today. I'm sure everybody scanned the agenda and was super excited to see an engineer presenting later on, and so we finally made it to that, right? So with that, I'll jump right in. Really what I want to, I manage irrigation district and levee maintenance districts for farmers. I'm an agricultural engineer, and that's been my focus. But really, the last 5+ years, I've been focused on the fisheries, and that's because the message that Jacob's brought out and UC Davis is that the floodplains are critical for the fishery. My districts reside in the heart of the floodplain, so I've had the opportunity to work with these folks and really look at what opportunities are out there. So the approach that we've had is really to look at the life cycle of fish, and you hear folks talk about functional flows, but there's certain products that were produced by the natural environment that supported our fishery. Now we have a highly modified system, so how with that highly modified, highly managed system, how do we start producing some of the things that we designed this system really to feed us, to produce food when we were settling California. And now we're looking back and saying, how do we update that infrastructure so it'll work for people and for the environment? So on the Sacramento main stem, which is the focus of my conversation, because that's where I'm from, we really have broken the river into the upper reach of the river, the spawning and rearing area, the main stem of the Sacramento River, and then the floodplains. So in the upper portion of the Sacramento River, the dam has created some challenges for fish. You know, we're rearing a cold water spawning fish in Redding, and if anybody's had the opportunity to visit Redding in the summer, you realize that doesn't make much sense. But we're able to do that because the infrastructure in Shasta Dam retains enough cold water. But what we don't have with that dam there is the natural process to produce spawning gravel or habitat. And so there's 3 types of projects that are shown here. The top right is actually the placement of spawning gravel so that these fish that come up can create their redds to deposit their eggs. On the bottom right is, and the bottom left, frankly, are ways for when those fish come out of the redds and enter the river, that they have a natural place for them to go to deal with predation. You hear folks talk about predation. Well, what we have in the upper Sacramento River below Shasta Dam is a river that's been scoured by high flood flows from Shasta Dam, but there is no longer diversity coming down the river system, boulders, trees that are creating the habitat, the velocity refuge, the shallow water that these very small fish need to escape predators. And so the project on the bottom left is actually one that River Garden Farms did. It's actually a 6-ton boulder with 2 tree root wads attached to it, and they place these in deep water in the Sacramento River, and we see fish swarming to these structures. Provides some fair competition, if you will, with the predators. The bottom right are side channels on the upper Sacramento River, and what this does is it provides shallow water where the juveniles have a place to escape the predators before they move downstream. They can fatten up, like Jacob's speaking of. So when you move down the Sacramento River, and this is the main stem of the Sacramento River, there's really 2 types of projects that we've looked at, and that's how do we get some floodplain habitat on the main stem of the Sacramento River. The top right and bottom left photo are actually the same project, and this is a project that was completed by Westervelt Incorporated, and they are basically a private mitigation bank developer. And what they did is they took a farm field that was within the levees of the flood system and essentially lowered the land elevation so that it would be flooded more frequently. And that's what you see in the top right. They put a notch on the downstream end, and now you have water backing up in there. And that can happen very frequently because it's within the channel on the Sacramento River. The bottom right is a way for us to supplement, and you saw Jacob's slide, but there are plenty of places in the valley where we can't have volitional passage for fish to move out and move back into the system. But we can look at what some of the products that were produced in the floodplain and see if we can provide a surrogate for that. And so we can move water out just like we have for a couple of decades now to produce habitat for waterfowl and rice decomposition. We actually were producing lots of fish food. We didn't realize that. We weren't looking in the water, right? And so now we're just modifying that practice where we used to flood those fields, hold them for 3 months or so, and then frankly we'd stop adding water and it would soak into the ground. Some of it at the end of the really wet years would drain off back into the river. We've modified that. You heard Jacob talks about several weeks. Well, we've seen about 3 weeks. We get a maximum production of fish food. If we exchange that water with the river, we move all of that food back to the river. And so this is a way to support food in the river, in the main stem of the Sacramento River. Then you've heard about these larger landscape type projects. And I want to talk to you about 2 of those briefly. One is Tisdale Weir modification, which is very similar to Fremont Weir and the Yolo bypass, but it's on the Tisdale bypass, which feeds into the Sutter bypass. And then the second is the Knights Landing outfall gate structure, which feeds into the Colusa Basin. So the purpose of these projects are frankly just to increase the duration and the time when these fields get flooded. We have a lot of water. It's very important to have separate thinking between the San Joaquin Valley. I used to work on the Kings River in the San Joaquin Valley, the Sacramento Valley. I can tell you, we used to have intense storms on the Kings River, but we have months of flood patrol on the Sacramento River. It's a lot of water in the Sacramento Valley, and we've done an amazing job at keeping all of that in a very small channel or in our bypasses. These projects, what they tend to try to do is open those up so that they happen more frequently. So this is the example at Tisdale. If you can imagine the land surface elevation at that point is at about, the adjacent land surface elevation is at about 32 feet. The weir is at 45 feet. So the Sacramento River has to get really full before it overtops. And that's where it overtops now is that yellow line on the graph. So you can see in this graphic, the green line is the river surface elevation. And in this year, which was 04 or 03, 04, it was about 3 weeks of overtopping with Tisdale. Right now, there's a notch being designed to put into the Tisdale Weir for adult upmigration. If you lowered that to the land surface elevation, which is being proposed, it would go from 3 weeks of floodplain activity to 3 months. So we, with no additional water, same water that's coming down the Sacramento River, so there's no water cost, but now we have a duration of 90 days instead of 21 days, which would be fantastic for fish moving through our system. This project here, there's actually 2 structures just like this. They're designed to allow watershed drainage to enter the Sacramento River, but not to exit. And at these structures, what we're suggesting is that you simply reoperate these existing structures. You start to learn how they would recruit juveniles, but you, in the Colusa Basin, in this example, there's actually 15,000 acres of flooding that already occurs on land. It occurs from all of the west side runoff from the Coast Range, but there is no access point for juveniles to get out there. We're suggesting we need to start thinking about how we move juveniles out onto these floodplains. This is the natural historic floodplain. There really isn't a reason for why you couldn't move fish out there. We just weren't planning our infrastructure to do that. We need to rethink that. We need to do that and work with landowners to make that work for them in the winter. It really wouldn't change their drainage. It just changed the benefit that fish have when they get to move out there. So thank you for your time.
Secretary Ross, thank you. Members of the board, thank you for your time. One thing, as I get to play my next movie, that's my part. I'm the movie guy, I guess, in the group. Yeah, everybody has a part. And what I really want to talk about, and I really think is something that needs to be represented here, is the landowners. Right now, we have a very, very willing, cooperative set of landowners. You've got River Garden Farms, you've got Bryce Lundberg, Don Bransford sitting there, GCID, RD 108. All these landowners are engaged. And this is a collaborative spirit that maybe we haven't seen in the Valley in a long time. And when we can now bring together Autobahn, you know, you bring Megan's energy, you bring Jacob's energy to this, and we've created this collaboration, this partnership that, and Lewis's work into this too. Yeah, got to have the engineer. When we bring all this together, it really brings success. It really gives us a vision. It gives us something to move forward to. And if we could key up that last video, this video is really about the collaboration. You know, there's more of a story to what's going on, but it's also the collaboration that we have right now in the Sac Valley. And I don't mean to just confine it to the Sac Valley. We've got partners that are south of Delta that are coming up and helping us with money for science and other things. You know, we have San Luis Delta Mendota, and we also have seeing that these are important projects and contributing money to the science for this. So, oh. There it is. There it is. Looks like we're getting it teed up. Perfect.
For decades, rice farmers would burn their fields to get rid of the stubble left over from harvest. But in the 90s, regulation changed that. So we turned to flooding the fields. Essentially, flooding the fields does the same thing. It decomposes the rice straw. But what nobody knew, what none of us predicted, was the wind for the birds. They'd fly over and they would recognize these flooded rice fields as wetlands.
They really are using this land as surrogate wetland habitat, which is really important because there's not much natural wetland habitat left here. We've lost 90 to 95% of it, and rice now provides up to 60% more food and habitat for waterfowl in the winter.
What we're learning now is that that same water on the floodplain has great benefits for fish. The infrastructure that we have today was designed and built for a purpose 100 years ago, without a lot of time spent on how it might impact fish.
Irrigation is the principal purpose for which man has developed the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers in the great Central Valley of California.
If you look back 150 years ago before the gold rush, the salmon population was the most abundant king salmon population really in the world. We basically had free-flowing rivers that came down into this large Central Valley that was a big floodplain. And when the people started showing up, we had to control the rivers because we were moving in. Our cities were next to the river. Our agriculture was next to the river.
We've built a system that has made over 95% of these floodplain wetlands no longer accessible to the river and to the fish in the river.
We now have a system where we store the water behind dams. For good reason, right? We need it in the summer for irrigation. We need to protect our cities and towns from floods. But in doing so and in channelizing all of our rivers, we've changed the way the system works, and you see that reflected in the crashing numbers of fish.
The salmon and trout populations in California are completely dependent on human management at this point. They're not going to make it without us giving them a boost and managing our water and our land resources.
I look at that and I say, here's real potential. Here's potential for small tweaks that result in revolutionary change.
Traditionally, environmentalists and private landowners have been at odds with conservation and resource management issues.
I think you had a lot of folks kind of fighting for positional arguments, and the drought really forced folks to say, hey, look, right or wrong, we all got to get together and get to work on fixing this.
We needed a couple partners to take that leap with us, and River Garden Farms were willing to take a risk and try something different just to see if it worked.
We really saw people that we'd never worked with before and started working together to really manage the water resources here in California. And it was through that cooperation that we started to move forward with projects that we feel are very viable and that can help the ecosystem.
And without them, we'd be nowhere. We need somewhere to try stuff out. Everything needs to eat. You know, just like we do, just like the salmon do, the bugs need to eat too. The rice fields are a perfect place to grow them because there's a lot of leftover organic material that breaks down into little bits of nutrients that the bugs can eat. Today we're actually working on an exciting part of the project, which is draining these rice fields and tracking the flow of the plankton in that water out with the water back to the river. The first thing we do when we show up today is pull a board out of the rice box and let a bunch of water flow out of the field. And our job is to sample along that trajectory for water quality and for plankton density. Cool. Looks good. We're sampling for lower trophic level productivity, so that means basically small crustacean life, essentially. So we got a bunch of large-bodied cladocerans. That's a good sign. That's like the prime rib of fish food. And then a bunch of small ones as well, which is another good sign. That means they're reproducing really well. They got a healthy population. Or good fish food, basically. Large-bodied cladocerans. That's what we're looking for.
Check out this sample that Jacob just pulled out of the field.
Is this what it's been looking like lately?
Mostly. Yeah, almost every field. But this, we had 3 weeks where we didn't get much growth out of this field here, and then it just exploded. The food's out here on the floodplain. We can grow that food here and get it back to the fish in the river. We can build a system that grows food for people in summer, but those same fields in winter can create habitat for ducks, for geese, for fish, create the raw productivity to make that system work. So now this is really a model for the 21st century for resource management and for California. To make this work, it takes folks like River Garden, those that have the vision, that do something that hasn't been done before, do it right, and really set a model for the future.
We can use our resources, our water, our land, and retime the way things have been to benefit the whole ecosystem. We can benefit birds, we can benefit fish, we can benefit all the critters that are out here by us remanaging how we use our resources.
These are win-win solutions. These are projects that work for farmers, that work for environmentalists, that work for folks to the south of the Delta and up here in the Sacramento Valley. That we are creating a new model, and that model is really all about understanding how nature works and integrating that knowledge into our management of it.
The new way forward is really figuring out how to make every acre of land have multiple benefits. Make it work for people and growing food. Make it work for birds who need winter or summer habitat. Make it work for fish. We've got to figure out a way to have multiple benefits and to use the limited resources that we've got as smartly as possible. And that's both for wildlife and people.
I think if we're going to have fish rebound, it's projects like this. And that this is where we build the foundation of that knowledge that we ultimately drive policy with.
We can continue fighting, to the bitter end, but no one's really going to win in that scenario.
I don't see any losers when we do it this way. It's a win for the fish, it's a win for the birds, and it's a win for people.
I don't know a single farmer who doesn't want to see more ducks, more salmon. We have the capacity here in the Sacramento Valley to demonstrate a model that has real global importance, that shows that you don't have to choose either or, that you can create a landscape that works for people, that works for the environment, that creates food for people in summer, that creates food for ducks, for geese, for fish, for all of our native critters the year round. And that's something that I'm just proud to be part of.
Thank you, and it really comes down to that collaboration. We have the groups, we're ready to do it, and I just think this is a new way forward here in California and California agriculture. So with that, I would like to introduce the Rice Commission, Paul Butner.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you, Roger, for that introduction. I've been to this board several times before, talking about the perspective of being a fish expert, and I'm sorry, a bird expert. And believe me, I'm very much committed to birds. We've been doing that for about the last 20 years in Rice. You've heard a lot about that already today. I just want to quickly remind you of a few points related to that before I get to the punchline of my new job. So our rice fields provide habitat for over 200 species of wildlife. About 325 to 350,000 acres are flooded in the wintertime, and that's, as we've heard, a big part of all the food resources and the habitat that we do provide. This is a little bit of a concern moving forward, that we want to see that level of winter flooding continue, which is why we passed AB 2348 last year to provide some incentives to continue to do that. As water costs increase, it becomes difficult for growers to continue to put that water on the landscape. But if you needed to replace that with, that is to provide the same amount of habitat for birds without the rice fields, you'd have to create about 250,000 acres of new wetlands, and that would cost you about $3 billion. So there's some understanding there in economic terms about what this habitat means. And you can see there a pie chart showing about 60% of everything a duck eats comes out of rice fields in the Sacramento Valley. About a third of it from the managed wetlands. There's about 75,000 acres of managed wetlands nested in with about 500,000 acres of rice. And about half of those wetlands actually flood up with rice tailwater, We don't consume all the water in our fields during the growing season. About a third of it is drained off at the end of the season, and that's what about half of those wetland acres use to flood up. And then we can see here, the main reason is you see that tall dark line on the right, that's rice grain, essentially, in the field, and you see the red line is the amount of water birds, waterfowl, especially here in the wintertime. You can see that without rice, those birds would starve or leave the area because they just wouldn't have the food resources that are provided by the waste grain. Believe me, the growers would love to harvest every grain out of their fields, but they tend to leave about 250, 300 pounds to the acre, which is utilized by the birds. And so my punchline is that while I love being a bird guy, my rice guys have told me they wanted me to become a fish guy. The good news is that I have a lot of wealth of projects to build upon. UC Davis, Cal Trout, and others have spent a lot of time in the fields demonstrating that salmon grow really fast in rice fields, as we've seen today. And also doing those great fish food projects of exporting that fish food into the river. So when I came into this situation, I had to think about, okay, what can we do between the four corners of a rice field to be helpful and add on to all that? And so what we developed was a $1.4 million project. Half of these dollars coming from NRCS, the others are donated, but a number of organizations, we're going to see a little later. We know those fish grow fast in the rice fields. What we want to answer now is survivability. That is, how many of them raised in the rice fields can we get out the Golden Gate? So we have this project. It is largely UC Davis doing the science along with Cal Trout helping out, and I just kind of try to manage the thing best I can. We're in our first year. We went ahead and we put 30,000 fish into a winter flooded rice field. And within that group of 30,000 fish, we have this really cool science project by UC Davis, where we're actually putting quite expensive little tags into about 900 of those fish. I call them $300 fish when they're done, because that's about what the tag costs. But what the tag allows us to do is literally track these fish all the way down through the watershed and definitively know what % of them get out into the ocean. Here's just a few pictures, rich with tractor work and cages and boats and all kinds of fun stuff. Rochelle Tallman, pictured in the middle there, is the lead grad student. She's amazing. She repairs boats, she rides boats, she builds cages, she does surgery on fish, which we are going to see here in a moment, because I want to take you through a video experience of this project.
Today is super exciting because today marks the first day of our project. We were able to put in fish into the rice field, and we were able to do 5,000 tagged fish from the Feather River hatchery so far. It's pretty exciting. There was a couple obstacles actually getting to this first day in terms of tagging and working with collaborators. So it's really exciting to see the fish go in, because it really marks the start of this project.
So there was fish going into the fields, and then largely because of the flooding this year, we had to move to cages to protect those 900 fish that we needed to do surgery on after they grew to size.
So today we're going to be deploying our cages. They are 4x4x4. They're made out of PVC pipe, and they're encased in plastic mesh. What we plan to do to get the fish in is we're going to actually make kind of a cut within the mesh and then put the fish in, and then use resealable zip ties to close it back up again.
Those cages were going on the other side of I-5. That's the I-5 bypass by the causeway by the airport. And here's where we were just deploying the fish into the cages. So the cages are out there in the bypass floating, and so you need to put these fish in these ice chests and take them out to the floating cages and put them there. Off they go. And now for the really fun stuff, get to see some fish surgery.
So today's our first day of surgery. In order to do that, we put the fish in the drug bucket first. We then get their fork length, 85. We take weights, 8.2. We make an incision, insert a little transmitter. Sew them back up and then put them in their recovery bucket.
Fish out of surgery?
Out of surgery.
Renee does that surgery. It takes about a minute of fish. It's pretty amazing, and we had a great sort of block party out there on surgery day. It was amazing, and we had special interest from Armstrong and Getty, who came out to witness it as well. Radio anchors here in Sacramento.
So one of the many ways that California rice benefits the environment, we just watched some fish surgery.
Yeah, they're implanting microtransmitters in tiny little salmon that'll swim off and do what salmon do. And California Rice is working with UC Davis to help replenish the salmon population in our rivers and streams. It's just amazing work.
Yeah, they do some anesthesia on the fish and put a little transmitter in there and then send it on its way. It's pretty amazing.
The technology is astounding, and obviously it's just great for the environment. Good stuff.
Good stuff. And so this is my final slide. I just want to make it clear that if it wasn't for the contributions of a number of organizations, again, NRCS coming in with half of the funding, Syngenta with a very large percentage of the funding as well, and all these other organizations, we would not be able to do this project. We have about 3 more years left on the project. We'll do the same science program with the 900 telemetry fish again next year. And what NRCS is looking for out of this is a practice, a developed practice by which growers can sign up to use their fields for fish habitat moving forward. So that's what we're hopeful to be able to demonstrate within the course of this project. And that's all I have. I'll turn it over to Mark Biddlecombe.
So what's a duck guy doing here? Besides keeping you from lunch. I only have 50 slides, so not to worry. It'll be quick. It'll be quick. No, really. I will be brief. Ducks Unlimited is obviously about wetlands. I'm not the duck guy. I'm the wetlands guy. We do a lot of habitat restoration that are wetlands focused, obviously, for waterfowl. But as we evolved in our thinking, we've come to realize that those habitats obviously benefit a lot of other things besides just ducks. And fish are one of those huge beneficiaries of that. So what I want to do is talk just very briefly about 3 projects that we have been involved in. So I'll start out on the coast, come into the valley, and then end up north of Sacramento. So the first project that I wanted to very briefly touch on is the Napa plant site. Napa plant site is in the San Pablo Bay, and it is a restoration site that we took a salt production pond out of production. It was sold to the state back in the late 90s, and took that out of production, restored tidal action to that. It's not cheap. It's $13.4 million for this 1,100 acre site, but the response has been tremendous as far as wildlife. I don't have a pointer, so I can't point it out, but trust me, it's on the right-hand side. All of those areas are areas that we've restored. We've done tens of thousands of acres in the San Pablo Bay. It's Highway 37 right around the bottom there. But this particular site is north of Highway 37, and as I say, it's about 1,150 acres. This is what it looked like before restoration, and it really was literally a moonscape. It was a plant production site, so what they would do is bring in seawater and then evaporate it through a series of ponds, and once it got up to the very upper end of these ponds, they would harvest the salt. So this is what it looked like when we started, and you can see the salt crust, and it was horrible conditions. That's a big sinkhole up on the right-hand side, and it was very difficult working conditions, but we did manage to get it done. And in 2010, after many, many permits, Ashley, you appreciate this, numerous years worth of permits and modeling we had to estimate where the salt plume would go, et cetera. We finally breached in 2010. And the response was amazing. So on the left, you can see what it looked like from the air before restoration, and just 8 months later, We had vegetation response, and the wetlands were coming back and looking fairly good. And the wildlife's amazing. I mean, literally, you have ducks that show up within weeks of this project being done. Rails, snowy plovers, all kinds of threatened and endangered birds and mammals, and Chinook salmon, and along with a wide variety of other fish. There were, I believe, at least a dozen fish that immediately start using this restored floodplain. Coming back into the valley, Cosumnes Wetlands Preserve was just south of Sacramento, probably a half an hour from here. We just completed last fall the Cougar Wetlands Project. This again is it's the upper end of the delta, so it's tidally influenced, but it's fresh water. And this area was completely cut off from the river, and again with about 10 years worth of permits, literally 10 years worth of permits. We did this construction in, I think, about 6 weeks, but it took us 10 years to get there. What we did was open up the levee that separated the Cosumnes River from this floodplain. And again, the response has been quite nice, although this was very recent. We just finished this last fall. This is what it looked like after construction was completed. And the area of the breach is up on it's kind of out in the trees on the very top part of the slide. And we cut these channels and restored hydrology back to this whole floodplain area. Produces the invertebrates that everyone has been talking about, allows fish to come in and go out. We made sure that no fish could be trapped in there. And this should benefit Delta smelt and a lot of other species as well. That's what it looked like in March. And that's when the water came in, and it's a beautiful marsh. I was out there, I guess it was in May, and it was covered up in shorebirds. It was really great. And quite a few ducks too. Cinnamon teal were all over the place. It's really gratifying. It's truly, if you build it, they will come. And then this one is a fantastic win for fish as well. The Butte Creek salmon recovery. Back in the late 90s, it was decided that we really had to do something about Butte Creek salmon. They were literally down to the last 100 fish. It was a low count that we had. And this project took, Ducks Unlimited was involved with duck clubs up in the Butte Sink. We wanted, and you know, we're not being super altruistic. We're here for the ducks. But we recognize that we have to work together. We have to restore these floodplains. We have to maintain water for all these, for the rice farmers. Rice is so important for our interests. And the duck clubs, they need water too. So we have to make it fish friendly, right? So a lot of the diversions that we put in was to make them fish friendly. Some diversions that we put in provided fish passage. We put ladders, etc. Some dams came out. We opened up 25 miles of the Butte Creek that it was not fish friendly back to them being able to migrate up it. Combine that with some access that they have to Sutter bypass wetlands, and bam, we went from 100 individuals to upwards of 20,000. It's been a remarkable success story. All it takes is collaboration, cooperation, and a lot of cash. And we'll get there. You know, the cash has been kind of a theme throughout everything, but there's money out there, and we're pretty good about getting it. The propositions that have been passed have been very helpful, and we see nothing but a bright future. And the partners that are here, the partners that are on the slides that I showed you, there's so many people interested in making this work. Farmers, other landowners, obviously the agencies, and a lot of federal agencies too. The first project that I mentioned that was $13 million, we got $8 million from NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, because they were interested in fish. Be glad to spend their money to do things for ducks. But it works for everyone, and that's the point. Thank you very much.
Can I just say thank you all. You all deserve a hearty round of applause. And what you're, and what you are doing now in particular, as we look at where we've been the last decade, Louis, I agree with you, and I remember being on your interview team for Ag Leadership, by the way. So, Yeah. And somehow he's put it to good use, right? No, but the drought has had such prolonged impacts on all of us and on our communities and built a different kind of awareness about things. And one of the reasons I was so passionate about working with the previous governor and with Chuck Bonham and Louise Bedsworth in creating the Biodiversity Initiative is because I know from my experience, I know in my heart, and I know from watching all of you, the importance of partnerships and collaboration, and that many times a missing piece has been the landowner. But this is what will create the results and change people's minds about how important it is for us to create these triple bottom line wins. And so I just want to thank you all for your leadership and your willingness to capture it in beautiful video and in great graphics and preaching this story about what we can do working together for the long-term interests of all Californians and for our natural ecosystems. So I just want to thank you all for what you're doing and to say that your timing is perfect, as we've been charged last week as we were with EPA and resources and CDFA to start working on our water resilience portfolio. It's these kinds of things, and you might have noticed the first bullet point of what we need to accomplish is multi-benefit projects that provide multi-benefits for California and our natural systems. So kudos to all of you, and thank you.
Yeah, I've got to echo that too. It's so nice to hear of the cooperation you guys have together and actually getting excellent results. And, you know, as a farmer, it's good to see a good image out there for us all. So we'll open this up to questions. So, Ashley?
I just
John?
want to say it was fantastic. So when are you going to take this on tour? Yeah. You know, where's the next?
Yeah. Since Big Jagger's got heart valve problems, we're going to be replacing him.
I'm loving it.
Yeah.
Arenas up and down.
Yes, exactly.
Obviously, we're very proud of what we've been able to do up there. But I think the thing to remember, as Ellen pointed out, there are different regions in the state, and not everybody can replicate this. I mean, you know, the core of this is water and rice, and it creates a synergistic effect, and we have migrating waterfowl that come in every year. The salmon issue is newer. If you go back to the 90s, our district was sued and shut down for killing winter-run Chinook salmon. And if you go back to that litigation, fixing that one screen should have replaced the salmon runs on the river. They obviously continue to decline. So we spent $750 million on the Sacramento River or in the Sacramento Valley building fish screens, and the population still declined. And along the way, we were developing partnerships with people. The Rice Commission actually started the partnership deal when way back in Mark Reasoner. Actually, it went to DU first, and birds and ducks and feed in the fields. We brought Mark Reisner up, and he could see the benefits of the industry. And so, and now the salmon populations are continuing declining. So a lot of what was talked about today was done completely outside the boundaries of the districts. And those dollars are coming from south of the Delta Ag, urban folks, our district, 108 and other districts. We make water transfers. We save some of that money to do these projects. And you have individual landowners contributing time and money to this. So, you know, it's a wonderful story, but I get a little nervous because, I mean, if I'm in the, you know, and the thing, we have had a consistent supply of water. And if if you're south of the Delta, you have a consistently interruptible supply of water. So the challenges are different. But I think the important thing to remember is the partnerships that can be developed that can get you through this, because ag alone is not going to get there. You need the outstanding NGO people that are there to help. Now, sometimes it takes a while to build trust, but that's trust going both ways. But anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Don, can I respond to that real quick? Sure. every region has its own demand, and all of this must be customized, district by district, farm by farm, region by region. There are no silver bullets. We're here talking about the floodplain. I mean, really, it's about puddles. Why is rice so important for this discussion? Because rice is a place where the infrastructure exists to spread that water out, create those puddles. But there is a universal, not just lesson, but a concept that underlies this that can be applied, and that's that not just our infrastructure, but our imagination as Californians, our way of looking at the landscape is really based in an obsolete way of picturing how people and the environment work together. And that whether we're talking about understanding that letting Smokey the Bear put out fires for the last 120 years hasn't really worked out, or understanding that in our ranch lands that fencing our cows onto small pieces didn't work out either, that we had to understand the flow of fire through timber, understand how animals move across ranch land, understand how water moves across and over the landscape. It's out of that understanding of nature and natural process that these outcomes spring, and that there really are applicable lessons in each one of our regions, in each one of our resource disciplines. And I think that we're necessarily focusing on one right here, but this kind of collaboration could be coming to you from ranchland coalitions, from timberland coalitions, could even come, God forbid, out of the San Joaquin Valley, where there are incredible wins to be had. So.
Thank you. Jacob, if I may stay with you for a second. So following up to Donald's point, if we were to look, or you were to look south of Sac Valley into the Sacramento, or excuse me, the San Joaquin Valley, for example, or another region south of the Delta, where you do have flood water, but it's more intermittent, sporadic, right? Not as plentiful, not annual, clearly. Can you anticipate, or would you anticipate to have like fish development benefits in those areas where you can create a floodplain on those lands that might be supportive or productive? For example, agricultural land that can take on winter flooding but may not be able to take it on each and every year with that consistency. Would that kind of more sporadic nature be disruptive, and you would not anticipate to have a like developmental benefit for fish, or would you expect to have a like developmental benefit for fish?
Luckily, we don't have to speculate. In collaboration with Ducks Unlimited, with Merced National Wildlife Refuge, with landowners, with river partners. In the San Joaquin, we've had multiple similar experiments that show that the fish use floodplain where it's available. We see similar food webs develop. We see similar growth. Is it exactly the same? No. The San Joaquin's fish were mainly spring run fish. Why? Because the snows accumulate on Mount Whitney in the high southern Sierra, and so the big pulse of water across the San Joaquin was a snowmelt pulse. It was a spring pulse, a later pulse. That means it's a different system. But there are ways to adapt, to take advantage of this ground and of this time that really, of this productivity that we've been squandering for generations. So I would just, let's put a little finer point on it. Right at the confluence of the Tuolumne and the San Joaquin is River Partners, a former dairyland that is now a restoration site of nearly 12,000 acres. It's across the river from the San Joaquin Refuge. There we are seeing the exact same kind of benefits about how we're looking back in order to move forward. It's not going to be restored. You're never going back. But if you can recreate the flood patterns, then you can restore the ecological function. You can do that not just for fish, but for bugs and bunnies, for endangered brush rabbits, for the riparian forests, which are also keyed into these flood patterns. That's how mud flats are made to grow cottonwoods. That's where you get the habitat for yellow-billed cuckoo. All of that plays in together. So I think the San Joaquin has as bright a future. It's just going to take a little bit longer to get there.
Bryce, and then we need to.
How exciting. What an amazing presentation. What a great band you guys have. I was thinking there's got to be a theme song in there somewhere. Golly, right. Fabulous to.
Shelter, just to pick up on that thing.
Which one?
Give Me Shelter.
Give Me Shelter.
Your next song.
Oh, right on. I'll look that one up. Fabulous to hear from Secretary Ross that this coincides with Governor Newsom's executive order of multi-beneficial use. I was wondering if you guys might comment on how this might coincide or connect with voluntary agreements and Governor Newsom's encouragement to fulfill the voluntary agreements. And then finally, how can we help? What can we do as a board to support this type of effort?
So I want to speak for 108 specifically on the voluntary agreement aspect. And when I look at the work plan that I presented here on the Sacramento main stem, that's largely what we're envisioning for SAC main stem. I think it incorporates the learning that we've had here. So I think that it benefits what's there in the voluntary agreements. I think maybe the biggest piece, though, that from what you've seen here today that applies to the voluntary agreement is the ability to build on partnerships and to keep folks from kind of taking positional stances, and so that we can keep progressing, we can keep learning, and we can keep moving forward. I'm concerned that without voluntary agreements on the table, that we get into the what's right, what's wrong, and folks end up struggling and fighting, and it's harder to be cooperative, harder to keep the community support from the growers and their participation. So I think they're very different. What we've been doing right here clearly is not in voluntary agreements, but it's the same sort of ecosystem functions that we hope to be able to express with voluntary agreements.
Does that work? Okay. I think the key is voluntary. What I said before, collaboration and cooperation, that's what it's going to take. I don't think that we're going to mandate fish coming back. I think we're going to have to work together in many different ways. And I think we also need to remember, and this is why I showed projects from the coast up. We're not in this alone. We did some work out on the coast that really helps fish out there. And they go in and out. I mean, we have to remember that they travel. So it's not about just what happens in the Sac Valley. It's about what happens in the entire system. And that's what we're looking at. But I do think that voluntary is the way to go. I just don't see this happening in any large scale without the cooperation of everybody. So that's my 2 cents. That's what Ducks Unlimited believes. Everything that we do is with partners, and it's partners, not adversaries.
So Bryce brought up the question I was going to ask. What can we do as a board to help? And Ellen, this goes for you too. What do you see the board being able to do to help move things forward? Because we feel strongly about this as well, that this cooperation with the Sac Valley is an excellent project for all of us in the area. And Ellen, what we're faced with in water in the San Joaquin Valley and throughout the state. So I hear you talk about 10 years to get a project done, red tape, and I understand that very well. So I mean, I'd love to be able to cut through that and maybe get some kind of special help, but do you have anything that we can push forward for you?
Well, Don, if I could, I'll just start and then others can add to that. Thank you for the question and thank you for the offer. I think obviously the starting point is I think the executive order sets this up quite nicely. last week, and then obviously we look forward to working with your team and other agencies on the portfolio. Obviously, we think this ought to be a piece of that portfolio front and center, and I think providing some more dimension to that I think would be really helpful. So I think that is surely one of them. You touched on the permitting. Of course, we're just huge fans of the work that Ashley and Sustainable Conservation is doing with you and lots of others on the expedited permitting. We do think that would be helpful to a lot of these efforts. And I think, again, just I think having the governor talking about reactivating our floodplains as a new way forward for California, I think every chance he's out and about, I think would be really helpful, because obviously we're excited about this, and I think a lot of people, the scientific community worldwide is excited by this concept. So I don't think there's any downside to it. I think, as you've heard, I think there's just lots of promise and lots of upside. So, and we'd sure welcome your guys' thoughts on how we can help you in this effort as well. So, anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, no, we're kind of running up against a time limit here. I apologize, but go ahead.
So I think we were close with regional water management planning, and but just not quite. I think we need to be thinking about watershed management, watershed planning basis. The Sac River is trying to move forward integrated watershed management. It deals with water supply. It deals with watershed functionality, and approaching it that way, I think we need to align our funding that way as well. Right now, we try to protect certain types of funding, and then when you try to implement, you have to line up, 4 different types of funding and 4 different types of permitting, and it really makes it difficult to implement watershed type projects. So if we could line up planning on a watershed scale, funding on a watershed scale, and multi-purpose, permitting with the understanding that there's trade-offs even between species, and get our agencies thinking about watershed permitting, I think that would be the direction I'd like to see us all moving.
Ellen, any comments?
They took both of the things that I would have highlighted. So, and I think, in the San Joaquin Valley, there are going to be some opportunities on the riverside. It's going to be more about sort of wetlands that are not connected to rivers, and about upland habitat, and all of these same issues come into play, and making it easier to do. So we stretching our water, and we're stretching our dollars, and stretching using the time that people invest in this in a better way, I think is all important.
Very good. Thank you very much. I really appreciated the panel, and Ellen, thank you too. You're welcome to join us for lunch in the room opposite here, and we're going to start back up at 1 o'clock. So thank you.